Good morning to our viewers in the US and good afternoon to our participants in Germany and Europe. Welcome to our online event, Informed and Resilient, How to Protect Democratic Societies in Times of COVID-19 and Digital Change. Like almost all our events, today's meeting is not only about informing about what is happening in the US, but about discussing important common challenges from a transatlantic perspective and to exchange thoughts and ideas from both sides of the Atlantic. The Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, or in English, the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, as a German institution with civic education centers all around Germany and a little bit more than 100 offices worldwide, is hosting international events also about transatlantic relations and our close partnership between Germany and Europe and the US and Canada all around the year and all around the world. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, most of our regular events and visiting programs, both here in the US as well as in Germany and Europe, had to be canceled. Yet online via Zoom and YouTube, we would of course like to stay in touch with you. Today, I would like to welcome four outstanding panelists to our transatlantic dialogue, two from Germany and two from the US. In alphabetical order, Julian Yauch, Project Director, Strengthening the Digital Public Sphere Policy at Stiftung Neue Verantwortung in Berlin. Shawn McDonald, co-founder Digital Public in Washington, D.C. Brian Edward Ray, Director, Center for Cybersecurity and Privacy Protection, Cleveland State University in Cleveland, Ohio. And last but not least, Tabea Wilke, founder and CEO of BotsWatch Technologies GmbH. GmbH would be limited liability in the US, in Berlin. We'd like to give all our panelists the opportunity for a brief introductory statement. Just in order to pave the ground, I will ask all of them an opening question from my side, but please feel free to add your own aspects and do not feel restricted to just answer my opening questions. I kindly ask all of our participants or our panelists, though, to restrict your opening remarks to, let's say, 5 minutes each, so that we have a few more minutes for Q&A with our audience. I will briefly introduce our panelists before you will deliver your opening remarks. After these first statements from my four panelists, we may still have time for a follow-up question. After that, I would like to hand it over to my colleague Jan Bösche. Jan follows the chat room. So to all our participants via Zoom, please post your questions to our panelists in the chat room. We will try to answer at least some of your questions during the next 50 to 60 minutes. Tabea, if I may, I would like to start with you. Tabea Wilke is the founder and CEO of the cybersecurity company BotsWatch Technologies GmbH, limited liability, finalist at the SXSW Interactive Innovation Award Privacy and Security in 2018. Tabea has more than 10 years of experience in technologies, in the technology sector and news industries, both in the public and the private sphere. She is a member of, now it comes, of the Association of Computing and Machinery Special Interest Group Artificial Intelligence, and member of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers Working Group to develop a standard for the process and of identifying and rating the trustworthiness of news sources. Tabea holds a bachelor degree in media and communication and a master's degree in international relations. Tabea, thank you so much for joining us. Last time you were in Washington, D.C. attending one of our events was, if I'm not mistaken, in September 2018. Back then, bots were the big topic, if I remember correctly. In the meantime, it is also about the dangers of deep fake, as you've pointed out in your research. To become, as a democratic society, more resilient against these dangers, you talk about better educated societies. What do you think is needed to achieve this?
Thank you, Paul, for the introduction. And I have to apologize for my bio, obviously. You did very, very well. I applaud you. So thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to join today. We are not only a cybersecurity company, we are a cybersecurity company focusing on information threats. That means for example, deep fakes, but also disinformation and misinformation. And we developed a technology that is able to detect these information threats in real time. And this is the reason why we published a white paper. Go on our website, you can download our white paper. And part of this white paper are deep fakes. As one of the most important information threats. First of all, we live in unprecedented times. No one really could imagine that something like deep fakes or manipulated media or visuals or even audios would appear. And the unprecedented times also relate that to two major developments. One development is a rapid technology development. That means computing processing power is increasing every three and a half months. So it's doubling every 3.5 months. And we have our smartphones that are mini computers today, and enable us, but also to do good things, but also we obviously see a lot of bad things happening with these totally awesome devices. And at the same time, what especially we're discovering is, or what we are looking at, is an increasing amount of information noise. So it's hard for many people to distinguish between what is true, what is false, who to believe, what is a reliable resource, or what is a reliable news or information, and what it's not. So this is the first aspect, having an information space all over the globe that is increasingly changing. At the same time, you have geopolitical conflicts that get into this information space and try to change it, try to shift it, try to shape public opinion, as we see in many events such as mass shootings, terrorist attacks, election interference, not only from foreign governments, but also from domestic actors. So this is the second aspect, geopolitical conflicts getting into our information environment. And the third aspect is that, the major challenge is that the identity of a society depends on reliable information. It depends on that what we see right now, for example, this Zoom meeting is real and not a deep fake, that we are real people and talking in real time. And this also applies for the economy. The economy is deeply dependent on the authenticity of information, on the stability of databases, and the integrity of information. So these are the major aspects what we are looking for. And how to protect democratic society, or how we can better educate society, how to better understand these information threats. Our white paper is the first step. Go on our website, download our white paper, learn about the major threats, what they are, what they mean, what cases have been in the past. But we believe, and this is also a reason why I also attend events like these, that we think an informed public is a resilient public. So the major challenge for politics or the society in every democratic society is how to tackle this problem. And we think as soon as the people know what's going on in the society as an information threat, is a domestic actor trying to shape public opinion, is a foreign actor trying to shape public opinion or a specific event, it's better for the public to understand this threat and to act according to the threat.
Thank you so much, Tabea. I can see behind you at your wall, there is a clock saying the time in San Francisco, and there's a reason for that, because what I've learned is you've opened a subsidiary company of what in San Francisco, correct?
That's true. Yeah, that's correct.
I congratulate you for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I'd now like to move on to the US, or to be more precise, to Cleveland, Ohio, and to Professor Brian Edward Ray. Brian has extensive experience in information governance, cybersecurity, and data privacy. He co-founded and directs the Center for Cybersecurity and Privacy Protection. Ray's research focuses on security and privacy regulation, national and international jurisdiction over data, and data governance, collection and use policies at the municipal, county, and state levels. He's part of a small team of researchers that in 2018 established the Internet of Things Collaborative. In 2016, Ohio Attorney General Mike DeWine appointed Brian to the Cyber Ohio Advisory Board. Brian also is an expert in comparative and international law. He was a Fulbright scholar in South Africa and has published extensively on comparative constitutional law and social rights. Last time, Brian, I think we met in January for an event in Washington, D.C. about a United Nations report and the question of how the digital world or sphere can be applied to the SDGs. Thank you for joining us again, this time virtually. Hope we'll meet again in person as soon as possible. One of your research areas is digital surveillance. From your point of view, how can democratic societies strengthen their resilience without undermining the liberal values and principles of democracy? Ray, floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks to the Foundation for organizing this discussion. Should be really interesting. I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of it. As my bio indicates, really what it boils down to is I'm easily bored, and so I like to try out new things. And so I'm going to tell a story of my latest endeavor, which is related to the work on privacy and surveillance, but goes deep into digital tools for health surveillance, and specifically the digital contact tracing tools that have merged, and the Google Apple exposure notification tool, or GAIN, which I'm going to use that acronym, which has emerged. And so I'm going to tell a story about the GAIN tool and how it's played out primarily in the US, but also to a similar extent in Europe, and then bring it back to the themes that we're talking about. It's a story I've been telling for a while, since I started looking at these tools. And the perspective I've developed is that we've been preoccupied in puzzling ways with the privacy and surveillance risks at the expense of trying to figure out whether and how these tools might actually work, and in particular, without thinking about how privacy fits in sort of with the larger constellation of trade-offs that we've been making. And I thought I was going to just tell that story today, but I've been working on a longer piece looking into the root causes of how that narrative has emerged, again, primarily in the US. And researching that story made me realize that the story is actually a nice microcosm, maybe a sad microcosm of the themes that you've teed up for us today. So let me quickly lay out the story and then I'll circle back. GAIN, this tool, is still widely distrusted in the United States. Only 3 states have even started to try and use it, and in those states it's been very limited. And more importantly, this tool and others have been presented in the media and academic accounts as unwarranted expansions of state surveillance and another data grab by big tech, in spite of the fact that the way they actually work doesn't really present those threats, and in fact have, at least with the GAIN tools, been privacy protective to a fault, I would argue. So to give one example, a recent San Fran Chronicle article warned that widespread adoption of the GAIN system, quote, creates a huge risk that data would live on well beyond the pandemic, giving governments and corporations easy access to information about people's movements and healthcare needs that eclipses what they now have. So we're talking about Google and Apple. And this Chronicle article is saying this tool is going to eclipse what Google and Apple already have on us. Well, the reality is GAIN is privacy protective to a fault. It only collects rotating anonymized Bluetooth identifiers that sit on the device's phone. So far from eclipsing what Apple and Google have now, it goes out of its way to avoid collecting any personal information. And then the protocol for it and the restrictions that Apple and Google have imposed restrict pretty significantly what even public health authorities can do with it. So why this disconnect between the reality of how the GAIN tool works and deep distrust in the United States over its use? It's really been become a political non-starter to use apps. I tried to get Ohio to think about it, and the response was there's no appetite, zero appetite for an app. Well, this gets to the bigger story. At least in the US, this distrust in government and big tech really has accelerated during the pandemic on both sides. And it's been fueled in large part by conspiracy theories and disinformation spread on the tools that are distrusted somewhat confoundingly, specifically social media in particular. And so on the right, the tools have been swept up in the narrative around resistance to things like shutdowns and government overreach. To give one example, again from Ohio, an Ohio lawmaker on Facebook warned constituents that, quote, armies of agents will be trained on Apple and Google technology to track or trace people and will forcibly isolate you and all of your contacts. This was a recent post by an Ohio lawmaker. And there are others. There are other examples. On the left, these concerns have been fueled by a narrative that really hasn't changed since the beginning and hasn't changed to reflect the realities of these tools, about their risks for surveillance in particular, and reinforced by the legitimate concerns in the past over police and government use of surveillance tools that have been again deployed in ways to try to crack down on the Black Lives Matter protests. And then, in fact, what's interesting is we see in public narratives a conflation of contact tracing itself for health purposes and what's being done by the police in sort of obtuse ways. And so the Minnesota Public Safety head of public safety actually made that equivalence and said, we're using contact tracing to track down protesters. And so there's been this convergence on both the left and right. Now, these concerns are not unwarranted, especially concerns about government surveillance creep and big tech, given the US's response after post 9/11 to expand surveillance tools to at least nominally combat the crisis, as well as big tech's miserable record on privacy. And of course, to make matters worse, in the context of the pandemic, states like China and even South Korea began to use digital surveillance in really aggressive ways that legitimately raised these concerns. But in the US, even after it became clear that this wasn't happening, that there was really no appetite by government to try to expand this, and that big tech was going out of its way to be privacy protective, the narrative has persisted and the distrust has intensified. And so why is that? Well, to sum up and then to tee up the discussion going forward, at least in the US, and I think in most of Europe as well, because of the European Union stance on how these tools ought to work and their limits, rather than illustrating, as the foundation teed up for us, quote, accelerating trends in digital surveillance, I think that the gain story in digital contact tracing more broadly, in fact, shows how the other half of what the foundation teed up for us is true. That, quote, conspiracy theories and the rise of disinformation have weakened trust in facts and scientific findings. And in this context have done so in a way that resulted in politicizing a tool in the US that had real promise. And for our discussion, I'm not focused on that failure in particular, but really on how the root causes that I've set up neatly and sadly illustrate these challenges and how these challenges can get worse in the context of a pandemic. So I'll leave it there and then we can pick up in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate it. Let's stay in the US and move on to Shawn Martin McDonald. I think last time we also met in January this year, just weeks before we unfortunately had to all cancel our regular events and visiting programs due to COVID-19. Shawn is the co-founder of Digital Public, and he is the CEO of Frontline SMS. Shawn is a senior fellow with the Center for International Governance Innovation and works with numerous research institutions. He is a lawyer, a researcher and writer. He holds a JD/MA from American University with specialization in international law and alternative dispute resolution. Shawn's research focuses on civic data trust as vehicles that embed public interest governance into digital relationships and markets. Shawn, thank you so much for joining us. Against the backdrop of the corona pandemic and additional digital information available to governments and companies, you call for more oversight and governance. How could that happen, given that we live in times where technological change is so fast? The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, for a great question and for a great conversation. Really looking forward to engaging with everybody. I really just want to pick up on Brian's story. So, funnily, 5 years ago, I still was CEO of Frontline SMS, which is a technology company that develops last mile tools. And we saw that our work started to get used to explain or justify why international actors should have access to call detail records, which are extremely sensitive mobile network operator data sets, in order to perform contact tracing. And I did what anybody would do. I got a grant, performed first-person in-depth legal research on the efficacy of call data records and contact tracing as a practice and its legality in domestic and international law. You know, the normal thing. But it has been then a funny ensuing 5 years where the role of contact tracing as a technology has grown so substantially. In a lot of ways, I found my research specialism, which is data trusts, because of the holes in the ecosystem that I found researching contact tracing. And now it is sort of the rest of the world has kind of found data trust and is now, unfortunately, in some ways, having to grapple with the contact tracing ecosystem. But I want to point out that the point of a contact tracing app is not to protect your privacy. It is, in fact, to improve a public health response. And what we've seen roundly across many international deployments is that there has been no discernible public health impact, even when adopted by millions and millions of people. The head of Iceland's program has come out and said so. The head of South Korea's program has come out and said so. Members of Israel's Public Health Response Corps have come out and said that it is actively harmful to public health response. So I think that, you know, to pick up on Brian's point, there is, of course, this giant disinformation problem. And I wrote a whole piece called Technology Theater, where where the debate about using these important public technologies is really focused on things like the efficacy of Bluetooth protocols and not does it improve whether or not societies are able to heal more quickly or respond more effectively? Can it measure whether or not a person is wearing a mask? And I think that disconnect, right, our tendency to focus on technology and policy issues in a lot of ways undermines public trust. Pew recently put out, Edelman's Trust Barometer in 2020 came out and basically showed that across the board, adoption of technologies cause a diminution in trust in the institutions using it. And just today, there was empirical research that came out that showed that actually the adoption of technology is undermining trust in science and science institutions, and the way that things are being delivered can affect the health of those institutions. And so I think, just to wrap up, the thing that I think that COVID has taught us about governance of technology and about how we might do it is the fact that public trust is a validation requirement pre-deployment, right? We're seeing that there are now not meaningful differences between testing, does the app work? Can it send a physical notification, and will people use it? And if they use it, will they use it to achieve the goal for which it was deployed? And so I think finding ways in which we can revive dialogue. The thing that has happened is that we have moved to a place of unilateral action, where whether it's a data policy based on privacy, or it is international data transfers, or it's establishing what information we need to enter different countries, we're seeing that these are large unilateral actions being taken. And we're seeing a reversion away from the kinds of diplomacy that I think built the resilience in the international order that a lot of the security and resilience in the title of this panel refer to. And so I think, from my perspective, the things that are really important to focus on are these points of harmonization and these opportunities to build on those core strengths in harmonization, focus on things like shared validation structure as a product of market access. So being able to control access to markets and then offer a beneficial market access to organizations or technologies that apply high public interest standards and have met high validation requirements. Strong dispute resolution systems. A lot of what's happened with the digitization of this work is that things that would have gone to courts or would have been managed by fiduciaries are now being managed by customer service or apps or not apps. And then lastly, I think that one of the things to look forward to is hope, is that in a lot of these spaces and a lot of technology, we've seen that conversations about inclusion and equity and quality to an extent, have been largely kind of conceptual or academic. And one of the things we can really clearly note about COVID is that when we don't create holistic responses that not only meet people on smartphone platforms, but in social benefits and access to justice protections, we're not necessarily fulfilling that promise. And I think that COVID and the technology and the public policy that's resulted from it are significantly more aware of the practical necessity of that equity and accountability in technology design. Anyway, hopefully that's a start. I am really looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shawn. I hope we will be able to get back to some of the aspects, but since you've raised the issue of unilateral approaches, let's hope that we perhaps get also kind of a multilateral perspective right now. Back to Germany, last but not least, back to Julian Yauch. Julian is head of the project Strengthening the Digital Public Sphere at the Stiftung Neue Verantwortung, an independent think tank in Berlin. In this capacity, he analyzes and evaluates existing approaches to strengthen the digital public sphere and to identify potential regulatory measures to safeguard against harms. Prior to this, Julian had already worked on topics of digitization, digital public and data protection. He led a Know Your Rights campaign at a Berlin-based NGO that dealt with EU data protection rights. Julian completed a journalism degree and has worked as an intern and freelancer in various editorial offices in Germany and the US. His PhD, that's interesting also to you, Brian, perhaps, his PhD in political science explored US states' transatlantic relations. Very interesting. Part of your research, Julian, and program portfolio is the European Democracy Action Plan. The EU Commission says this plan should ensure that citizens are able to participate in the democratic system through informed decision-making free from unlawful interference and manipulation. The plan is about lessons learned from COVID-19, from the COVID-19 crisis for electoral integrity and media freedom. From your point of view, Julian, what should be the most important recommendations?
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here and to get into the question that you posed and to maybe some of the participants might post later. The European Democracy Action Plan that you alluded to is one of the flagship proposals that the EU has, and it deals with disinformation, with resilience, with informed public spheres, just like you mentioned. And so I want to circle back to that in the end of my brief remarks, but to understand it and to understand where this Democracy Action Plan is coming from, I think 2 points are necessary to be made. And I want to focus on first one being how disinformation during COVID-19 times is different from other disinformation, but also how it's very similar and kind of the same. And the second point is how do we deal with that and how do we strengthen resilience? And that will lead me back to the Democracy Action Plan. So just very briefly on the first point on disinformation during COVID-19, I think it's become very clear, we see very plainly that disinformation that's spread online can have carries real risk and can have real negative health effects, both for the individual as well as for public health. And that relates to, fake cures being peddled online, to advertising for drugs that might or might not work, disinformation on how masks are useless or where the virus is coming from. So all of that is particular to COVID-19 in a way. And one of the points that I want to highlight here of what makes this so special is this idea of a data void. This is the idea that if you have a void of information, for example, on search engine results pages, for example, in video portals and in news feeds on social media, it is easy to fill those voids where information is lacking, but what that void is filled with is not necessarily truthful and correct information. It can also be disinformation, it can be false information. And this is what we probably saw at the beginning of the pandemic, when really nobody knew anything about this novel coronavirus, and any posts that were published online, any search and results that people came across, they could have easily contained false information. And this, at least in the beginning, is probably how a lot of the disinformation on COVID-19 spreads. And data voids, though, is not a phenomenon that is only refined to COVID-19. We see that in other disinformation campaigns and issues as well. And that leads over to the point of like recognizing also that COVID-19 disinformation is not so dissimilar from other disinformation that we saw. Even though you put that in the title here, rightfully so, disinformation in the times of COVID-19, there's also similarities to other disinformation. It spreads easily, it spreads mostly through social media, it spreads from smaller platforms to larger platforms to the mainstream media. And interestingly enough, it also attaches itself to existing conspiracy tropes. So if you're already inclined to believe anti-tech, anti-elite, anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant sentiments or conspiracy myths, COVID-19 disinformation will allow you to latch onto that, and they will have some sort of myth and story that will allow you to connect your beliefs with COVID-19. So it's really not disinformation on COVID-19 that's new, but it's really the global scope of it that it's so makes it so remarkable and noteworthy. And my second point, and circling back to the European response, is how do we deal with that? How can we strengthen resilience? And unfortunately, even though I work in a think tank, I don't have an easy answer. I don't have a single answer. I don't think there is. It's a very complex issue. And I think a combination of education and regulation can help societies achieve resilience. And this is kind of what the EU, I think, is aiming for with the Democracy Action Plan and also with the Digital Services Act, another piece of legislation. And so I just want to close by mentioning 2 or 3 things that could potentially be in these proposals that the EU is considering. And some of them relate to rules for big digital platforms, for the tech companies. This is only a small piece of the solution, I think, but it is an important piece. Realizing that disinformation is not new, it's not Facebook or Google or TikTok creating these issues that we have in society, but it can be an accelerator. It can amplify issues based on the financial incentives that these companies have, based on the way they are designed. And we've seen that self-regulation really has not been sufficient here to deal with disinformation. So what could happen, what I could foresee as being somewhat useful, and what I would hope the EU would consider as well, is to establish some sort of transparency and accountability mechanism for platforms. Whereas we now rely a lot on self-regulation, I think it would be helpful to have compliance standards for platforms. For example, mandatory reporting guidelines on how content is moderated and deleted on platforms, how the recommender systems, the algorithmic recommender systems work on these platforms. It would also be helpful to have mandatory databases for ads instead of voluntary, somewhat functioning databases for ads. It would be helpful to have independent oversight, just like we have in other industries where companies get audited and have to be part of an oversight compliance mechanism. Might be useful to establish something like that in the EU as well. So all of these are ideas that are being discussed in the European Commission, will be discussed in the European Parliament, and I'm sure in European national governments as well. And I've just really very briefly sketched them out, but I'm very eager to hear the other panelists' thoughts on this and potential criticism of this, as well as the questions from the audience on this. So again, thanks for having me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Julian. Getting back to your issue, because you've raised the topic or the question of self-regulation, perhaps one follow-up question to all our panelists, and I kindly ask to provide some answers in a nutshell, as brief as possible, so that we have some more time for questions from the audience. But there is a funny coincidence in this meeting. We actually have 2 US panelists with a very, very strong professional background in law or legal affairs. And we have two German participants with a very strong background in working with media. And usually, I have to honestly say, in many events we host, it's actually the other way around. Referring to that, I've worked both in, let's say the very far west, now in the US, but also in Latin America, close to 20 years ago. I've worked in Asia, also in Far East Asia. And we always, in all our countries where we have our offices, we deal with these topics. And experts from Asia or from Europe, the US and Asia, every once in a while tend to point out that, let's say, when it comes to data protection in Asia, you could say governments tend to be in charge. When it comes to the US, people say, okay, when it comes to data protection, private data, businesses tend to be in charge. And when it comes to Europe, experts sometimes point out, in Europe, society tends to be in charge. Would you agree? Perhaps, Tabea, let's start with you in a nutshell. Would you agree?
This is definitely an interesting question. I would challenge that in the US, the data protection is being seen by the businesses. I think at least the internet platforms are working really, 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 really hard, saying that they are not responsible for their content. So I think there's a lot going on there regarding the data protection or how they handle the content on their platforms. But yeah, I would agree that there are different, very, very different approaches. Especially we saw in China, we saw in South Korea, how they handle the tracing apps and COVID-19, the COVID-19 response. And in Europe, a totally different approach. Germany, a different approach, to be honest. I don't see a very homogeneously approach in Europe, but Germany more leaving it up to the people to decide how far they go or what measures they take. I think we are now at a moment where some things may change, but there's not this surveillance approach we see in China or South Korea. And at the same time, I think what I see in the US, there's also a change regarding how they deal with data protection. I think there has been a lot have been a lot of discussions between especially members of the Senate and Congress talking with European politicians and even in Germany, how they handle this data protection. I think we will see a lot of processes with the new administration or in the foreseen future.
Okay, thank you so much. Perhaps one more panelist from the US so that we get this perspective. I would like to, Shawn, Brian, Europe and US differences. Brian, would you like to?
I'll jump in. I mean, so your topology maps perfectly with respect to digital contact tracing, right? In Asia, we had government programs that were deployed rapidly. In Europe, we had I don't know if it's society, but we certainly had the Data Protection Board out early with very specific guidance, the most specific guidance. And then in the US, interestingly, to Tabea's point, I mean, I take it what you mean by business being in charge is business being in charge of either lack of or existence of regulation. And I think that's generally true. But Apple and Google sort of did a 180 with respect to the constraints they've put on the Gain app versus what they put on other apps. So certainly still in charge, and in fact in charge to the point where they've dictated that only one app per jurisdiction, and what the jurisdictions themselves, the governments themselves, can do with the app. So it works there. Curiously, more broadly on surveillance, we've seen a groundswell within the US at the local level. And this is where the facial recognition bans have emerged and other. So there's real appetite for a more societal response, but it's kind of stymied by the political structure we've got. But it's sort of finding outlet in local movements, I think.
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, Paul, I know that you wanted to move right along, but just super quickly, I actually really disagree with the characterization because I think it's overly simplistic. I think that we're seeing, to look at the way that the US government is managing data policy, having just taken antitrust action, largely performative, but still antitrust action against TikTok, and is clearly weaponizing against Huawei. I think that, it's very hard to say that there's any one group of actors here who are really delivering. And just to throw in, I think that while we talk about Europe and society, I think we've also seen that we're actually talking about government regulators. We're not really talking about society, and that responsiveness to things like private rights of action in a lot of cases has been really variable, and also an ability, a person's ability to bring a claim is also really variable in a lot of cases. So I think, we want to be really clear with that these big broad brushes sometimes feel really convenient, but the EU is no less government than the US is no less government than in many ways Asia. What a lot of times varies is that the propositions, or at least the authority structures, are different and differently aligned and differently transparent and accountable.
Sure, thank you so much. Julian, now you have to jump in. Finally, two sentences from your side.
No, that's all right. I don't think I have anything to add. I think the complexity of the issue got very clear by the previous speakers. So we can jump to whatever you want to talk about.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. I would now like to hand it over to my colleague Jan Bösche. Jan follows the chat room. Jan, any further questions from your side or from our participants?
Yes, one of the first questions we got is about the transatlantic cooperation in this whole topic. The question about specific steps that are possible for the transatlantic community to ensure an ongoing dialogue on these questions about Corona and about digitalization.
Mm-hmm. Tabea, I think you touched upon the issue already earlier on. Perhaps you would like to answer first?
I can try. This is a very, very complex question, to be honest, and very hard to answer. So I am not an entirely close friend to regulations. So I believe in the ability of people to decide what is right or wrong. And I still hope that people all over the world understand technology, because technology is not the big actor here, and how to responsibly use technology. So I would, I have to check on the question again. Sure, a dialogue definitely has to take place, especially how we agree on specific standards, but really on a very low level, that the economy can still rise, that we still have business models where we can provide people information. Because just an example, when for example, I'm at the moment here in Berlin, and when I want to read some media outlets in the US, there is a blog saying, okay, you're coming from Europe, you're not allowed to read this article. So I cannot access specific websites in the US or wherever. So I think the internet and the internet is so a great thing, and regulations are not very helpful for so many things that were helpful in the past. So I think we have to be very, very careful with regulations. But of course, a dialogue, of course, and agree on standards, I would support that.
Are you referring to, let's say, websites which do have a metered paywall and are based on subscription, or? I
think it's a geo-blocking. Mm-hmm. So GDPR related. So since we rolled out the GDPR in Europe, there are some websites in the US you cannot access, referring to the GDPR. So, but at the same time, we see development in California with the Privacy Data Protection Act and other things that are good for the people. I think this is the most important aspect we have to keep in mind. It's for the people, to make life easier, to connect people, and to help founders and other people to develop business models that help people to have a better life in the end, and to make information accessible for the people. I think this has still to be the most important things. Of course, there are threats and we have to tackle these threats, but at the same time, we have to keep in mind that the internet is a good idea itself.
Yeah, thank you so much. Julian, since you've done your PhD on transatlantic relations between, let's say, I think it was Germany and US states. So do you see some leg room for mutual initiative discussions, panels, platforms on this topic between the US and Germany or Europe?
Right, I do, but that's maybe also my optimistic and somewhat biased view of the benefit of transatlantic relations, which I guess some might question in these times. But I do have hope, and I do see ways that the transatlantic community can take steps to work on this. I mean, on a very low but important level, it's events like this. It's, you know, bringing together people from Europe and the US to discuss common issues. I mean, it sounds very basic, but the fact that we can do that is, I think, very important. And you can jump up or scale up from that. You can make the demand that companies that work globally should have, like Tabea mentioned, have common standards. You can make the demand that your elected representatives in parliaments take note of the fact that markets today, in some cases, don't respect national borders and don't even respect the ocean that's between the US and Europe. And so there's cooperation necessary. I think the question was kind of asking for more specific steps on Corona. I'm not entirely sure if that can be detached from the general transatlantic dialogue and strengthening the dialogue that we need. But I think these very basic communication channels that need to be kept open between citizens, between governments, and between businesses on both sides of the Atlantic, those are crucial in any type of discussion that we have.
Yeah, thank you so much. To Brian and Shawn, and I'd like to kind of rephrase the question in a more, perhaps a little bit more provocative way. How often do you have a look at what is going on in Europe when you deal with these challenges? Let's start perhaps with Brian and then move on to Shawn.
Yeah. So two thoughts. One, to Tabea's point about the promise of it. I mean, what was really remarkable is early in the pandemic, there was a de facto really active, not only transatlantic, but multi-transnational dialogue among grassroots technologists and privacy people trying to figure out how could we develop digital tools in ways that would not do what China did. And the DP3PT protocol, there was a young researcher in the US at Stanford who's of Chinese descent who, anyways, it was amazing conversions. And what was interesting is we've converged on a de facto standard, in part pushed by Apple and Google, but Apple and Google essentially adopted the European approach as a risk management tool. So that was I think a really positive example, though it may have gone astray in terms of its end result for me. On the flip side, Shawn mentioned the TikTok antitrust investigation. And what we're also seeing troublingly is some sort of nationalization efforts, and it's everything from from requirements that data get hosted locally, which is both economic, both an economic tool, but also often, unfortunately, a tool for governments to be able to exert greater control. And we're seeing an acceleration of that. And I don't know if we can get there, but dialogue around those kind of standards, I think, is really important so that we maintain not micro internets that are specific to each country, and or start using tools like antitrust as sort of de facto tools of, I don't know if you call them hard diplomacy or soft war, and maintaining dialogue. Unfortunately, the U.S. is not in a great position right now to take the lead on that, but those are where I think we really need to keep pushing. And then again, really broadly, I mean, Facebook is sort of stumbling its way to trying to have a mechanism to deal with disinformation, but they're not. They can't do it, and it's really troubling that they're doing it with this kind of star chamber. Although I don't know how else to do it, but certainly dialogue around how to create meaningful transnational tools to to accomplish what a Facebook and others are trying to do would be really important.
Yeah, perhaps
Yeah,
you take on that.
Yeah, thanks for that. One of the things that's really fascinating about times of emergency is you get this groundswell of really well-intentioned people who sort of surge to response efforts. And one of the things you learn being in the humanitarian technology game for 10 years is how destabilizing that often is. And whether you're talking about it being nationalistic action in setting surveillance standards, in reducing mobility, in engaging in whatever, designing whatever protocol. To me, the short answer to your question, Paul, by the way, really quickly, is yes. I pay attention to Europe all the time in the way that they do this work. I'm increasingly looking for leverage, but and I think that and ways to move beyond the financialization of punishment, or the ways to move into more of a dialogue space for setting some of these norms. But the two places that I really want to focus, based on this being a disaster and COVID response being a disaster, is one, the area of emergency powers. In nearly every domain of rights, we have we have checks on executive power, and we give more and less authority to executives under oversight to take large actions. We've never done that in technology, and very few countries have defined emergency powers as it relates to data. And then the second piece, and I think that this is stark but important, we don't know quite yet what technology's Nuremberg is going to be, right? But we do know that there is an ethical crisis in the way that technology systems are rolled out and managed. And so until we find a way to sort of to hard code some of the institutional ethical infrastructure into the way that emergency technologies are deployed and government emergency powers are rolled out to do that, it is very hard to know. I mean, to Brian's point, to everybody's point, it's hard to know when we'll get there. But the importance of that dialogue, of that mutual self-restraint at the sovereign level and at the global level is critical. And I just wanted to give a quick plug to a book. You can't see it. It's called Data Justice and COVID-19 Global Perspectives. It is a global survey of academics focused on data security and protection, and essentially the line between government power and technology, and where and how it's moving during COVID. And I was fortunate to be able to contribute to it, but the things that are happening in many places around the world, Pakistan, Hungary, et cetera, around the way that COVID technology has been rolled out is stark, and something that the international community can come together around.
Thank you so much, Shawn. Please, Jan, please jump on in if you have some further questions from the audience. Otherwise, I would have one question. We have a few more minutes. And unfortunately, yeah, we're running out of time, but perhaps one more question, if there is no further question from the audience. Jan?
I guess there is a question about best practices in international cooperation. I sense you already talked about that, but perhaps if you have another example of one thing where it really works and perhaps good things came out of it, then feel free to mention it now.
Any examples from your side?
Genomic data has been, I think, a huge success. It is highly classified, so there's not a lot of slippage in quality. International cooperation has been amazing, and the acknowledgement that the work around it needs to happen in a lab setting is nearly universal. So there's a strong series of gateways between discovery and application, meaning that it doesn't really suffer from public trust problems.
Do you have an example? I mean, just for people like me?
Yeah, so COVID, I mean, data sharing around COVID genomics has been unprecedented in the medical community, and they've gotten to the number of models of the virus, as well as, to coordinated vaccine research in a way that is just really, really inspiring and hopeful in a sense of international cooperation.
Although I think from my, there is sometimes the issue of peer review. I mean, of course, I think this is growing, but I get your example. Perhaps Brian, anything to add from your side?
No, I misheard Shawn at first. I thought he said economic data, and I was nodding my head. But it's also true, right? That economic data tends to have credibility, and that's what's interesting about that is it's, I assume, a largely market-driven demand, right? If you have, and anyways, so it's curious, but genomic data, yes, I agree. And I was thinking to myself, public health data, largely, although with some exceptions, and then of course, here in the United States, with some concern about eroding public trust because of the politicization. So, but I think that's right. If we can think about those examples where we find sort of common need and demand and willingness to share, and health data is a great one. And then, are there lessons to learn from economic data and how market forces can drive that quality? I don't know, it's interesting.
Thank you so much. Julian, anything to add from your side? No, but Tabea, perhaps in this case, you have the final word before we have to unfortunately close our meeting. And I would need to, because of course, this is also very close to what we do as Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, getting back to the issue of better educating the public in order to have more resilience. Perhaps you would have some best practice examples or some ideas you'd like to share with us from your side?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to get informed, to be reliable, what you share, what you read, and when you read something, not only read the headlines, but also the article or whatever the website is. Many people just read the headlines, so they're just tiny little steps to be better informed, especially on COVID-19. And COVID-19 is a very important case because, and a very, very helpful case because it's changing so rapidly. So the information you had last week may not be still, or may not apply today or next week. So be constantly informed, stay informed, cross-check your sources, and especially for events, vulnerable events, upcoming events, or during a pandemic, a natural disaster, or a terrorist attack or whatever, check the reliable sources you checked in the past. Do not visit new websites or websites who look like governmental websites or state websites. So there's a lot of going on, and as long as everyone keeps a little bit, vaccinated in a digital way, then we can maybe have a vaccine across the globe on information, and I think this would be helpful.
Thank you so much, Tabea. We very much concentrated on COVID-19, of course, and what implication it has. But I think all our panelists made pretty clear that the whole issue of resilience, being better informed, credibility also of news sources and so on is not something you can just restrict to COVID-19. It's in this respect also not a very new development, although things might have changed during the last few months due to some new technological applications, of course, but I really appreciate that you try to give our audience some kind of a broader perspective on these issues. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Please bear with us that we've not been able to answer possibly all our questions, especially, of course, from our audience. We could only touch upon some important issues of how to protect democratic societies in times of COVID-19 and digital change. But before we leave the meeting, I would, of course, like to express my sincere gratitude to all our 4 panelists for your time, your invaluable contribution, your interesting remarks. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. Thank you very much also to our participants, both in the US and in Germany and Europe. Thank you so much for your attention. We will host our next transatlantic online event on October 14. Please join us. For now, stay safe and goodbye.